Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you're joining us from Australia or around the world, welcome to the Australian Cancer Research Foundation's Behind the Science event. My name's Adam Spencer, really excited to be your MC for what promises to be a wonderful evening. I've got no idea where you are, but I know that I am sitting on land traditionally under the custodianship of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present and thank Indigenous Australians for their custodianship of this land. Now, it is 2020. It would be remiss for me to begin an event without using a few keywords. Unprecedented, new normal, challenging, all in this together. But seriously, every one of you watching this event knows cancer doesn't take time off because there happens to be a pandemic going around. And that was the challenge that the ACRF faced in 2020. Tonight, we meet some science superheroes and hear what they'll be doing with the money they're being granted, $6 million across 3 wonderful projects, despite the obvious challenges that 2020 posed. We're really sorry you can't be here to join us personally, but we're really excited that there are hundreds of you joining us online. Why don't we kick off now and meet some of our science superheroes? Look at them all here, our brilliant brains, our cancer conquerors, the recipients of our 2020 grants. Joining me here in the studio from the Garvan Institute of Medical Research, Professor Trifan and Associate Professor Marina Pyaich, and awaiting us merrily in Zoom land from the University of Queensland's Centre for Advanced Imaging, Associate Professor Jeffrey Hanna and Dr. Zachory H. Houston, and from the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre, Associate Professor Gerard G. Hanna and Dr. Nicole Haynes. Hello to you all, welcome, 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 and congratulations on the fantastic work you've been doing. Let's start by taking the pulse of cancer research in Australia in 2020. Zachory, I'll start with you. What's the impact of COVID been on working in labs, both in Australia and around the world?
From my experience, research hasn't stopped because it can't. And we continue to do our work. A lot of it's critical. That's not to say it hasn't had impact on researchers' lives, and that it has been troublesome for a lot of people. I mean, my own personal experience, I've been through several short-term contracts, and that has obviously changed the way you might go about research, but it's an adaptation process, and it's something you get used to. I think it's also given a bit of scope for people to have a bit of internal monologue and give a thought about how they do their research and where it's focused.
Nicole Haynes, if I can ask you, in general, we've heard, across the community, has heard about the impact of COVID on the university sector as a whole, quite challenging in terms of the funding landscape. Are we starting to see, or are you worried that we might see an impact of COVID when it comes to financing cancer research?
Yeah, I don't think we've seen kind of any immediate kind of consequences associated with COVID-19 on grant funding for cancer research. However, we are a little concerned about the long-term kind of implications associated with COVID-19, and certainly we'll have to wait and see what those implications are. But certainly we've been particularly grateful for organisations like that of ACRF who have continued to provide funding support for cancer research even despite the challenges throughout 2020.
One of the great things that ACRF does is it's the nature of the projects they deal with that are so exciting, and soon we're going to drill down into those 3 projects we're awarding this year. These are out-of-the-box ideas in some ways. They're radical, challenging concepts. Professor Hanna, how hard is it sometimes to get financial support for research that goes about it a bit differently, that is a little bit radical?
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to get money for blue sky research because most of the major funding bodies in Australia want to see preliminary data, for example, and the reviewers want to see preliminary data. But having said that, it is possible within your grant to put some blue sky ideas in there, which maybe are the next big things in science. So I think in Australia, it's a lot of applications in your main grant, and you have to factor in a little bit of blue sky research into your grants to get them up. So I think it's difficult, and maybe we would benefit from some schemes that are truly blue sky and open book.
Tree, when people hear about your project, quite an ambitious, quite a radical one, is it a challenging space to operate in sometimes?
Yeah, look, I guess for me and a lot of the work that we tend to do, the problem we always face is every time I tell someone my idea, they say, tell him he's dreaming. And the real problem is that when you do something that's a bit left field, particularly in the current funding climate where it's extremely competitive and our funding body is extremely conservative as well. So it's all about incremental change. So with high risk comes high reward, and that's exactly what we're about. And I think we're very privileged to have an organisation like ACRF willing to support something like that.
Gerry, Hanna, can I ask you, what are the effects we're hearing that COVID's had on the broader medical industry with the amount of space it's taken up, the limitations on people accessing other hospitals, medical services, etc.? A Cancer Australia report suggested in 2020 there's been a reduction in the number of people seeking treatment or seeking advice over potential adverse situations with regard to cancer. Are we worried that there's a bubble that coming down the line is going to manifest itself in terms of impact on patient outcomes?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question, and that is certainly at the start of the first wave back in March, we were very keen to protect the health system. We were very keen not to put patients at unnecessary risk of getting COVID. And our messaging was that unless cancer treatment was necessary, we would put that off. We also put off things such as breast cancer screening back at the start of that pandemic. Looking back, that was unnecessary. And when the second wave hit here in Victoria, we learned the lesson from the first wave, and we kept those screening initiatives going. In fact, we had quite a fundamental campaign across a number of providers and sectors, both public and charitable, encouraging patients to seek attention should they have any symptoms of cancer. That's been a very big campaign for the last 4 months, and we're still trying to get that out there. We saw cancer incidence, certainly in Victoria, drop by about 20% until about 2 weeks ago, and we've seen a pickup in the last 2 weeks, as I think patients and their families have had the confidence to come back out and seek help. But the message is very clear. If you've got a concerning symptom, go see your GP. Please seek help. We are here for you. We want to treat your cancer when it's in the earlier stages and curable rather than the later stages and more difficult to treat.
Marina Peich, if I can ask you about imaging as well, a lot of the grants we're seeing over the years with ACRF are about the cutting edge of imaging. We're literally seeing things now that a few years ago were not possible. Why is the imaging aspect of some of these cutting edge grants so important and so exciting?
Well, exactly. I mean, look, we can only know what we can see, right? And so up to date, we've been kind of able to only really study some of the slower interactions that perhaps cancer cells can have with the surrounding environment. And what's really exciting now is that we can really try to dig in and study the dynamics of immune cell signaling, so how these immune cells in the growing tumors in patients, in models, how they interact with the cancer cells and how they interact with other components of the environment. So going faster, deeper, and really trying to see, what we were not able to see before.
And that's what's so exciting about the work we are rewarding here this evening. So having taken that little snapshot of cancer research in Australia in 2020, let's dive deep now into these 3 amazing projects. Let's turn our attention now to the Garvan in New South Wales. Now, everyone watching would know the past few years, we've witnessed a remarkable transformation in the treatment of cancers. Major advances in cancer immunotherapies that target the body's immune response to cancer. We've read incredible stories in the media. Doctors saying they're literally seeing cancers melt away from scan to scan. But now we face a major challenge. Why do some patients have such remarkable clinical responses to cancer immunotherapies, while other patients do not seem to respond at all when in theory they have the same condition are receiving the same treatment? We'll step up a world first centre. Thanks to a $3 million grant, we'll have the ACRF Intravital Imaging of Niches for Cancer Immune Therapy Centre. It's a lovely acronym, INSIGHT. Awesome, but what the hell does it do? The centre will be the first place to first time enable researchers to see cells or molecules move in real time in the dark space below the surface of tumours and deep inside tissues. Professors Fan and Peich, this is really exciting. We've touched on this already, Tree. This has been in the making for quite a while, hasn't it? Give us the potted history of this amazing story.
Sure, all right. Well, so I think an idea like this just doesn't happen overnight. And one of the key things for the Insight Centre to come around as a vision was for a number of people to recognise that we really needed to get in the same room, not just the cancer scientists and the immunologists, but also the physicists and engineers who could develop and build the sort of microscopes that we need to be able to see deep, below the surface of these tumours. And, over many, many years, in addition to that, we really need to build an ecosystem in which we would then have a pipeline in which we could, take the sort of discoveries that we anticipate to make and then translate that discovery to the clinic. So it's about bringing together a whole bunch of people who wouldn't normally get in the same room together and who normally don't even speak the same language. We all know that mathematicians and physicists talk a completely different language to biologists. But what we have been able to do is be able to communicate with them and the sort of things that we want to do. So the microscope that we want to build, for example, uses a concept called adaptive optics, which comes from astronomy. Astronomers for a long time have realized that you can't see through the night sky because they're scattering because of all the dust particles in the atmosphere. And so they developed this concept of adaptive optics to correct for the distortions. So we're going to take that and shrink it down and put it inside our microscopes so we can correct for distortions coming out of the tissues that will allow us to look deeper than anyone has ever been able to look deep before. And also then to see things at the sort of speeds that we haven't been able to do before.
Let me ask you about that, Marina, the speed, the real-time nature of the imaging. Why is it so exciting to see things in that degree, that degree of precision, but also real-time imaging?
Well, it's at least, it's at least 10 times faster than the technology we've got going right now. And just, I can give you an example, for this, where we've already shown, for example, that some of the slower tumor cell and environmental interactions can potentially be targeted when you look at slower moving cells within the environment. And so some of these treatments we're now actually looking to translate into clinical trials with our clinicians as collaborators. However, the problem here, and for example, I'm working on pancreatic cancer. That's a very difficult cancer to treat. It's a cold, what we call traditionally cold cancer, doesn't respond to immunotherapy. So if we're interested in looking at how we can perhaps stimulate these cancers to respond to immunotherapy, we need to be able to catch the much more dynamic interactions that immune cells are having with the tumor cells. And so to do that, you need much faster, much deeper technology, and that's what we've got here.
It says that we're going to look deep into the immune system, below the surface of tumours, deep inside tissues. What is so interesting about that space, and how much do we currently know about what goes on there?
Look, it really is a dark space at the moment because a lot of our current technologies use static imaging techniques. You can imagine you take a biopsy, the tissue is now dead, and you're not capturing the live interactions that occur. And the reality is a lot of these interactions are very fast, very brief, transient interactions. So being able to peer into the dark spaces that we've never been able to look at before, I think is just going to open up whole new vistas, give us whole new ways of understanding how cancer cells interact and subvert the immune system so they can escape immune surveillance. And that's really important because I think that will be the key to understanding why some patients respond and others don't to immunotherapy. You
mentioned, Marina, you said some of the more slower acting interactions. So yeah, I guess if you're only seeing a scan every however often apart, you've seen what's changed. You've got no idea at which rate or comparative rates the different changes happen, and that can be quite important, can it, in understanding how these things interact?
Exactly, and particularly in the context of immune cells. So the slower tumor cells, stromal cell, we call them stromal cells within the environment that we have been able to catch are slower processes. So for example, development of this fibrosis or fibrotic matrix that happens in the tumors. And so we've got therapies that can, for example, modulate those interactions. But with immune cells, things are happening very fast. And that must be particularly important in pancreatic cancer because if you, so we know how dramatic the responses can be to immunotherapy if the patient is going to respond. So to even push a certain proportion of patients to become immunotherapy responsive, that's going to be a dramatic result in terms of moving that 5-year overall survival rate from 9% to 18%, 20% and above.
And because the reason this is worth chasing is when we see immunotherapy at its very best, the results are amazing, aren't they? There were some very high-profile cases in the media. There's some Australians who got into the advanced trials of these drugs, and I was hearing phrases like, it's like the tumour just melted away from this scan to the next. At its best, it seems to be an amazing line of inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. The immune system is enormously powerful. It's evolved to protect us, not only from the outside world, but against the inside world when it's turned against itself. And it's maintained, homeostasis, for want of a better word, for a long time until you develop the cancer. So really, a cancer in many ways can be seen as a failure of immune surveillance. So what we really need to now understand is how did that failure arise, and then can we put in some fail-safes to prevent it from happening. Okay,
I want you to put on your ambitious but realistic hat, because I know the challenges for research is that you do some amazing new work and you've suddenly got a journalist going, okay, so how many days before there's no more cancer in the world? We're not pretending that's happening at all, but what's your ambitious but realistic hopes that this program and this sort of new way of observing this dark space could unlock?
Personally, I believe that we'll be able to understand why pancreatic cancer is so difficult to target with therapies like immunotherapy. So we'll reveal something new that we don't know about pancreatic cancer. And I'm hopeful that within 5 years, we can even start to move that down the line to further towards translation into some sort of clinically testable hypothesis.
Tree, ambitious but realistic.
You're talking to the wrong guy about being realistic, I'm
Good.
sorry.
I love it. No ambition.
So I'll go ambitious first. Look, I think we're going to start small and just work on the idea that maybe in the cancers that we know that do respond, where only a fraction of them respond, can we turn all those into responders? And then the next step would then be to go to the cancers that we know don't respond. Can we now turn them into responsive cancers? And really, ultimately, I think what we want to do is to be able to harness the power of the immune system to eradicate all cancers. I mean, maybe in 10 years' time, we'll be well on our way towards doing something along those lines.
Well, Professors Trifan and Maria Paich and the entire team at Insight, good luck.
Thank you
very much.
Let's move our attention now to our second project, the University of Queensland, where a $1.2 million grant will establish the ACRF facility for targeted radiometals in cancer. The acronym is AFTRIC. It's going to be Australia's first facility for the discovery, development and clinical translation of, get this, novel alpha particle-based cancer therapeutics and radiometal theranostic and molecular imaging diagnostic agents. Whew. We've got Associate Professor Geoffrey Hanna with us and Dr. Zachory H. Houston. First up to you, Zachory. What does the H stand for? It's a little thing I've got when I get initials. Ever since I found out that Captain James T. Kirk was Tiberius in Star Trek, I've always had to ask about middle initials. What does the H stand for, Zachory H. Houston?
Harrington.
Oh, love it. Great stuff. Now, we all know, whilst new and improved treatments for cancer have been developed, cancer treatments can have a devastating impact on a person. Professor Hanna, your project's looking to try and help this in some ways, isn't it?
Yes, so we'll develop personalised medicines in a way with antibodies that are specific for the patient, which bind very well to the antigen on a cancer cell, and then use the alpha particles to hopefully destroy the cancer.
Can you tell us more, Zachory? Most of us don't hear phrases like radiometals, alpha therapy. I mean, obviously I know a lot about radiothermal theranostics, but for those watching who aren't as across the subject as I might be, what are we talking about here? Really bring this down nice and simple for us.
So radiometals are just a type of element that give off particles. And some of these particles are not damaging to cells. So those are the types of particles we use for imaging, kind of like what you do when you get a PET scan or a SPECT scan in hospitals. And they're really good for diagnosis. There's other particles that are released are damaging to cells. And if they're honed correctly, they can be used to kill cancer cells selectively. And so we're going to use these alpha particles, which have short, high bursts of energy, to selectively kill cancer cells. That's the idea of alpha therapy.
What are the particles we're currently using if they're not alpha, and what are the advantages of alpha particles?
So the current particles that are used commonly are beta particles, and they're used for treatment of prostate cancers and some pancreatic cancers and other solid tumors. They do the same thing, they kill cells, but they also traverse a little bit longer of a path. So they can cause damage to other tissue in the same area, tissue that's not cancerous. So that's, with alpha particles, it's a higher dose, or a higher energy at just where the cancer cells are. That also reduces side effects. So what you mentioned earlier, sort of patients having a hard go during the treatment, a lot of that's due to the side effects of the treatment. And there's no resistance known as well for alpha particles or any type of, the type of damage to the rest of the body is less. So patients are much better off and recover quicker from the treatments.
Jeffrey, from what I understand, what's really exciting about this program is you're not just working on how do we deliver the therapies or how do we measure their effects or how do we produce these alpha agents. I get the impression after examining the full range of this, talk us through the full range of what you're looking at with this program.
Yeah, in terms of imaging, we're really trying to understand what the effect of the alpha particles are. So we're trying to understand the radiation damage. So part of the project was to develop the first EPR, or imaging of the radicals created by the ionizing energy, to be able to work out the dosimetry, microdosimetry. So that's very exciting, as well as Zach just mentioned, SPEC to work out or where the actual radio traces are. So we'll be able to work out where the radio traces are from things like gamma emissions and PET scans, and then also work out the radiation damage by using electron paramagnetic resonance to measure the radicals, which are responsible for the death and ultimately of the cancer cell by destroying DNA. So we're starting from a theoretical approach and working all the way through to a translational approach. Part of that, of course, is developing new ligands to take these new metals, as well as new antibodies that are very specific for certain cancer cells. And I think that will be absolutely key to our approaches, to have very good targeting.
Zachory, when you get into projects like this that are complex and also quite broad in their approach, there often has to be a degree of collaboration. I get the impression you're collaborating heavily with national and international collaborators on this. Tell us some of the people you're working with and how broad a project this is.
Yeah, it's incredibly broad. It's going to take a worldwide effort to apply these. It's a technical area. It requires certain expertise in multiple areas of science. And as you discussed before, it's a lot of communication. But the funding that we got from ACRF has been critical to allow us to establish a preclinical facility, which will allow us to do a lot of tests and monitoring along the lines of what Jeff just talked about. We have to understand what the specific damage in the areas localized these therapies give. We also have to understand how we make them, how we image them, how we can use them commercially, what the different sources are. And this requires a huge amount of collaboration. So we have a very large team dedicated from this grant worldwide. We have collaborators in Japan, Singapore, the US, and Canada, as well as all over Australia. And it will be key to work with our clinical collaborators, our veterinary collaborators, and our preclinical collaborators in the other universities across Australia to really figure out the answer to this problem. And specifically, we'll work tightly with the hospitals in the area and around Australia to help deliver those treatments and translate those new treatments faster to Australia. So it's really a world first for instant alpha therapy, where other countries have had kind of a lead on us for several years now.
Jeffrey, I'm always inspired at events like this when I hear about the work that's going on in Australia, and often people in the general community are excited and surprised to hear in how many fields we're doing genuinely cutting edge work that's often not taking place in countries with much bigger institutions, budgets and the like. You must be proud, Jeffrey, to be part of a project like this that, as Zachory said, is truly cutting edge and truly international in its scope.
Yeah, I'm very proud of that effort, yeah. And my personal input in this is I'm actually a physicist, one of these people you can't talk to. And I'm actually an electron paramagnetic resonance spectroscopist, so that's where my expertise come into this. So I'm not really a major cancer researcher yet, but this grant has given me a magnificent opportunity to put my expertise into something that's hopefully going to make a big dent into cancer cancer therapy. So I'm very excited by the project and the opportunity this has given me as a physicist to contribute to this problem.
Can you run me through what was the specific branch of physics you specialise in again, Jeffrey?
Electron paramagnetic resonance. So I measure paramagnetic material. So of course these beta particles are ionizing radiation. So my expertise will be in characterising the radiation damage.
Not only do you speak the language of physics that most people in the community can't understand, I get the impression a lot of physicists wouldn't even be able to speak to you. That's an incredibly beautiful, very nerdy niche area. I love it. Put your hat on, Jeffrey. Give me the ambitious but realistic. What do you hope to achieve through this work?
A very ambitious target would be to find an antibody for brain cancer and be able to treat it. And that's something that's very difficult to do currently, and knock out some brain cancers with beta particles therapies.
Zach, you're one of the youngest people we'll hear from today, and youth is just wild ambition. You haven't been beaten down yet with the realities of day-to-day lab work. Just go total ambition on me, Zach. What do you hope this project leads to?
I think within the next 3 years, with the right collaboration from everybody in Australia, locally and internationally, we're going to start to see these targeted alpha therapies treating patients, curing patients from cancers that are not treatable by any other technique or method out there. And I think it's really exciting for Australia because we're in a very exciting time for giving these patients another chance.
Well, Associate Professor Jeffrey Hanna and Dr. Zachory Harrington Houston, and to everyone at AFTRA, congratulations and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
And now to our final project. We've already dished out $3 million and $1.2 million. And I mentioned in the introduction this year, despite the incredible challenges the ACRF was facing, they're granting $6 million to the nation's finest cancer researchers. So you don't need to be a physics geek like Jeffrey. Now that's 4.2 boom, boom. There's still $1.8 million going the way of the wonderful Peter Mack for the establishment of the ACRF Radiation Immuno-Oncology Program. Professor Gerard G. Hanna and Dr. Nicole Haynes join us now. Gerard, you know my first question. What does the G stand for in Gerard G?
I'm afraid it's not as exciting as Harris. It's Glyn, so Glyn, and it's my mother's maiden name. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful stuff. Gerard, most people have heard of immunotherapy and of radiation therapy. Your project's looking at both. In summary, what does the Radiation Immuno-Oncology Program aim to do?
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, we know that immunotherapy works very well for a small number of patients, not for everybody, unfortunately. And what we're trying to do is to say, again, a bit like the other project, say, how can we get immunotherapy to work better? We also know that radiation is used across a whole range of cancers to try and cure cancer and control cancer. But we know, again, in a number of patients it fails. And we're trying to bring these two treatments together to try and improve how they both work. Now, the premise was kind of touched on a little earlier. We know that some tumors are what we would describe as being immunologically cold. In other words, they don't react to immunotherapy. And by giving radiation in, we're almost making them into hot tumors, so to speak, so that the body's immune system can discover these tumors and target these better. We're doing this not just in standard drug immunotherapies, but in a very novel treatment called CAR T-cell therapy, where we take some of the T cells, these are immune cells from a person's body, we take those outside the body, and we try and program those against the cancer cells that the patient has. We know at the moment that these don't work very well in solid cancers such as lung cancer and breast cancer. And what part of this project also seeks to do is to combine both CAR T-cell therapy and radiotherapy in a way to make CAR T-cell therapy work in areas where it hasn't worked before.
When it comes to combining immunotherapy and radiation therapy, to an outsider that sounds like a wonderful and sensible thing to do. Have they been traditionally quite siloed? Is it a very recent and radical approach to try and bring them closer together?
That's a good question. We have a lot of case reports and also some early studies. The case reports initially were in those patients who received radiation for palliation for control of symptoms. And we discovered there were really quite strong responses in those patients. There are some early clinical trials that show that when you put radiation in, that it works better. What we seek to do is take that a step further and say, how do you fine tune that? One of the problems about combining both of the treatments is also there can be increased side effects from either, and saying, how do we select the patients better for the combination? How do we avoid the side effects? And how do we make both treatments work better in that way?
Nicole, in reading about the grant, I stumbled upon the abscopal effect. This is fascinating. You're looking to understand the abscopal, scopal effect. Can you explain to our viewers what the abscopal effect is and the insights you're hoping to gain here?
Yeah, it's actually a really fascinating event or phenomenon. We know that like radiation therapy is a localized cancer therapy. And so we know that radiation therapy has the capacity to kind of cause tumor cells to die within the irradiated site, and that can lead to the control of those tumors within the irradiated area. But what we now know is that radiation therapy can also activate our immune system, much like a vaccine. And so these activated immune cells can then go on to actually control tumours that are growing elsewhere in the body. So now you've got control of not only the tumour within the irradiated site, but now we can actually contribute to the control of tumours elsewhere in the body through immune-mediated kind of mechanisms. And this is really fascinating. It's a very rare event. And what we're hoping to do with this program is to really expand on our understanding of how radiation therapy can trigger our immune system so that we can better capitalize on this abscopal effect and actually kind of broaden kind of the number of patients where we see these type of events. Because if we can broaden this kind of this effect across different cancer indications as well as different patients, this will mean that we'll also broaden kind of the clinical application of immunotherapeutic drugs and improve their kind of long-term activity in cancer patients. Wow. It's very exciting.
It's fascinating, Gerard. I've heard this described as a reverse translational project. What do you mean by that?
Yes, so what we mean by that is we've had a number of clinical studies already at Peter Mac and also with our collaborators both nationally and internationally that have combined immunotherapy and radiation together. Now, in those trials, we've seen certain effects. Again, some patients who've responded very well, which is encouraging, but disappointingly, some patients who haven't responded. And in that reverse translation, we will be taking some of their samples, some of their information that we've already collected, and bringing that back to the lab and trying to examine that in the lab and say, what are the facets of the responders versus the non-responders? What can we improve or add to that treatment that makes the non-responders respond? That brings it back to lab in reverse translation. The hope is then to take from the lab back to the clinic to improve the clinical space.
Nicole, what for you is the benefit of having access to both a lab and that hospital environment?
Oh, I think it's a massive benefit for a program like this because essentially we want to be making sure that our preclinical work that we're doing is very representative of the clinical kind of scenario, so we can ensure that there is kind of direct translation of our findings from the lab into the clinic so we can ensure optimal patient outcomes. So it's really important that there is kind of direct communications between the academics within the research laboratories as well as the clinicians who are directly interacting with the patients so that we can ensure that we can achieve maximal outcomes from the use of radiation therapy and immunotherapy. So communication is key, and so having us both in the same hospital is a massive benefit to the program.
This is very, very exciting stuff, Professor Hanna and Dr. Haynes. In closing, I just want to point out the Radiation Immuno-Oncology Program, the RIP, was the only one I wasn't given an acronym for. I don't want to get ahead of the boys and girls in marketing, but it sounds to me like an absolute ripper. Tough crowd, had to move on. Good luck. Thank you so much for explaining your project to us today, guys. A big thanks to all our researchers from the University of Queensland, from Peter Mac, and here with me in the studio from the Govan. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Best of luck with your work, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to have a quick chat with two heroes of the Australian Cancer Research Foundation. They wear their capes outside of the labs, in the boardrooms of Australia, where they are forever shaking the tins and getting a few dollars or maybe millions of dollars sent in the direction of these wonderful researchers we've just met. The CEO of ACRF is Kerry Stridham, and Mr. Tom Derry is the chair of the board. Welcome to you both. Thank you. Kerry, for people who might be at their first ACRF virtual function, What is it about these 3 grants that really sits at the core of the Foundation's mission?
Well, I think, Adam, with working through this Medical Research Advisory Committee, who are made up of a panel of Australian and international researchers and experts in the field, we feel really confident about these 3 grants. There was a very strong level of interest this year, probably the strongest on record, given the circumstances. And what we feel is that through the advice of this panel of experts, we're confident that there's a very, very strong and high level of science behind each of them. There's a well thought through and executable program of research. And then of course, this is all done by the high level of talent that we have here in Australia. So we really feel that all 3 of these are worthy projects and that they'll go somewhere to help us on our mission to outsmart cancer.
Tom, I know from work with other organisations across a range of industries I've worked with this year or haven't worked with this year. I'll be honest with you, if you got in contact and said this year we've decided we're not going to award any money, we're just going to sit back and see where this goes, I would not have been shocked. Was there any suggestion or temptation to award significantly less than $6 million or nothing this year, just take a year off and see where we land?
Well, clearly around the board table there was a lot of discussion as to how we should handle this year with regards grants, for the reasons you outlined. Great uncertainty, but our view in the end, consensus view and unanimous view around the board table by the trustees was that, we must proceed. We must continue to support our scientists. This is work that can't stop. Cancer, unfortunately, knows no boundaries in terms of the fact that there are other pandemics going around. And we felt while we had the capital base to do so, we should continue granting, albeit less than perhaps we would have liked to this year.
One of the things that defines the work the Foundation does is this sponsorship of technology, infrastructure, equipment. We've heard about some of the wonderful stuff this year, the microscopy, the imaging. Why is it so important to have such good funding going to those particular device and technology aspects of cancer research?
Well, fundamentally, we believe that through providing technology, this is what's going to bring the breakthroughs in the research and that cutting-edge research. The other part is it's much needed within the research community. So we test that out every year. We go to our panel of experts and say, is this still the model? Is this the best use of the funds? And is this truly the way that we're going to get the cut through that we need to make headway with the fundamentals of cancer?
If you look, Tom, you would have seen this in your many years of involvement with the organisation, the sort of devices that you're funding now and what they're capable of compared to 10 years ago. I mean, think about the phone you're carrying around in your hand. Think about the computer you're using at home. Think about devices you're using now that would have blown your mind if you'd been told about them in 2010. It's similar at the cutting edge of research technology, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, it's interesting, 10 years ago, we were still funding cancer labs, physical infrastructure. But more and more as that was developed, we're now in a position where we're funding the technology because that's what's going to make the difference. Converting what took a man year to do one piece of research can now be done in 1 man day. And the quicker those scientists can get to work and do their studies, the quicker we're going to be able to manage this terrible disease.
And often with that ability to process at speed, it's just eliminating all the noise and the stuff that would have been a waste of time to look at, to then focus these people's amazing minds on where it seems the real heat
the real
is.
Issues are. I'd just like to come back to a point that you raised about the grants. I mean, as Kerry said, we look at it each year, but the interesting thing about the grants is the whole ethic we have at the ACRF, the Australia Cancer Research Foundation, that says what we're looking for is not necessarily the incremental changes that can come about from research, but rather let's support rather abstruse approaches provided the scientific rigour is there. So as an ethic, if you like, and as a value of what we do, we really try and focus on supporting those scientists that are prepared to think a bit further than just the incremental change. And out of that, we may get something very special.
And Kerry, one of the other driving values is to look at collaboration and increased efficiency. Zachory touched on this a little bit in his project, the breadth of organisations in Australia and around the world involved in it. Tell us a bit about the ACRF focusing on increased collaboration, improved efficiency across research projects.
Absolutely. Well, you would have seen from all 3 grant applications that we've awarded that collaboration does feature very strongly in terms of the criteria that we look for. And that can be both national as well as internationally. The other piece where ACRF takes quite a strong leading role is to collaborate with other cancer funding bodies. So, for example, in the awards we've seen tonight, we have a collaborative agreement with the Cancer Institute New South Wales, whereby for the Garvin Insight Award, they will be providing $100,000 over 3 years. And we have a number of these collaborations in place, which really builds efficiency into the system for the grant application process.
I'm going to ask you in a second about 2021 and beyond, Tom, but you've been involved with this organisation for a while, and if a few years ago someone had told you, when we get to our 30-odd year, it'd actually be done remotely, streamed, because there's going to be this global pandemic. But do you sometimes look at where this organisation is now compared to when you got started? I know you're a modest man, but you must be proud of what's been achieved by you and so many other people in this space.
Look, it's very gratifying, but we haven't started. We haven't started. As they say in the classics, you ain't seen nothing yet. and what we've got to do is we've got to continue to get more support so we can help the scientists. One of the challenges we've got is that everyone's concerned about cancer. Sadly, we all know someone that's close to us that's been affected, and people are worried about themselves being affected. So cancer is very important, and as a result there is a massive mushrooming of cancer charities, all of which have the best intentions in the world. But our view of the world is very simple. The quicker we can, the real answer is helping the scientists figure out how we manage this disease. And the quicker we can help the scientists, the better we'll all be. And that's the basis of the collaboration that Kerry's talking about with other charities.
But you can't provide that assistance, you can't help without your amazing supporters. And I mentioned at the top of the broadcast the C-suite, and I've been to some of your events, and there are members of the C-suite there, and there are some very generous individuals and organisations, but you're just as likely or more likely to meet school kids, mammals, the middle-aged men in Leica who are going on a long ride, some beautiful bald-headed housewife who shaved her head for a few $100s, a few $1,000s. The breadth of supporters of this organisation, many of whom are watching right now. What do you want to say to them about what we've managed to achieve in 2020?
Adam, they are truly amazing. We get inspired every day. The team and I arrive at work, and it's amazing what people come up with, particularly in a pandemic. So, people have continued to donate, people have continued to raise funds in various ways. We have a number of Cancerian committees around the country. And then, of course, we have people who volunteer their skills, volunteer their time. And the most meaningful thing I think we've seen this year is that incredible group of people who have actually left a lasting legacy and left a gift in their will. So to everyone, honestly, to the board, to the Medical Advisory Committee, we cannot thank them enough. This is all made possible because of their kindness and generosity. So thank you, would be what I want to say.
As we approach the end of the year, Tom, what thoughts are on your mind as you reflect on 2020 in the ACRF?
Well, an amazing year. I mean, we started the year thinking that we may get no revenue and we may not be able to do much at all, to a position where we have been able to grant our scientists some $6 million. And it's not as much as we would hope, but it's enough to get these 3 amazing projects off the ground.
Well, Tom, Kerry, in the toughest of circumstances, congratulations on an amazing year that has been 2020.
Thank you.
And to everyone watching at home, thank you so much for joining us, to our interview subjects, our wonderful researchers, our fundraisers and friends of the ACRF who who are out there around Australia and the world, thank you so much for tuning in. We can't wait to see you in the flesh in 2021. But until then, stay safe, have a Merry Christmas and end of year, and we'll see you for another great year with the ACRF next year. Bye-bye.